Greetings from Universidad de Jaén. My name is Antonio Vicente Casas Pedrosa, and today I will be presenting on English prepositions closed or open word class, a bibliographical overview. First of all, let me just present what are the main aspects that we'll be tackling in this presentation. After a brief introduction, we will cope with the different definitions of prepositions that have been provided so far. With regard to English prepositions, there are two main options. They can be classified either as a closed word class or as an open word class. Then we will be speaking about linguistic greetings, which happens to be a possible solution and, from our point of view, also a plausible solution. Finally, we will end with some conclusions, and we will mention what are the main references that we have been using for this paper. With regard to the introduction, this is aimed at focusing on the morphological nature of English prepositions, and we'll be trying to provide an answer for the question whether they constitute a closed or an open word class. In order to do so, there will be a bibliographical overview, and this is a process consisting of different stages. First of all, we'll be having a look at some of the different definitions of prepositions that have been included in the main grammars of the English language. Later, we will focus on their defining features, that is to say, what characteristics make prepositions different from other word classes. And by doing so, we will be also paying attention to what are the similar characteristics that they share with other parts of speech. Of course, it will be necessary to mention the word class particles, since this is closely connected with prepositions. We'll try to identify what are the main problematic areas, as well as to suggest some of the possible solutions for them. Now we move on to the possible definitions of the word class prepositions. One of them was provided by Jacobson in 1977. And according to him, prepositions may be defined as particles that indicate a relation between the noun and noun equivalent they govern and another part of the sentence or the whole sentence. He also established a distinction between central prepositions, which are always transitive, that is to say, the ones requiring a complement, and the rest. Some years before, Kurme had already provided another definition, which is included in Handelston 1984. A preposition is a word that indicates a relation between the noun or pronoun it governs and another word, which may be a verb, an adjective, or another noun or pronoun. That would be the case of in the sentence, I live in this house. There is also a distinction, as we suggested, between central and peripheral prepositions. And the first group will require three criteria, which are mentioned in Quirk et al. 1985, but were previously already included in Jacobson in 1977. Firstly, they cannot be immediately followed by a that clause. So it's ungrammatical to say, I am sure of that he's honest. Secondly, they cannot co-occur with an infinitive, with or without to. And thirdly, they cannot govern an immediately following subjective case form of a personal pronoun. So it wouldn't be grammatical to say between I and you. In 1999, Byron et al. Also included their own definition of prepositions. According to them, they are links which introduce prepositional phrases. As the most typical complement in a prepositional phrase is a noun phrase, they can be regarded as a device which connects noun phrases with other structures. Just 3 years later, Huddleston and Pullum included their own definition: a relatively close grammatically distinct class of words whose most central members characteristically express spatial relations or serve to mark various syntactic functions and semantic roles. Is it possible to reach an agreement on the nature of prepositions? Well, as stated by Orno Chelith in 2002, defining prepositions has always been a recurrent problem. And the main reason for this lies in their semantic and syntactic heterogeneity. In fact, Trujillo already highlighted that it's not easy either to say what prepositions are or to determine how many there are and whether they belong to a homogeneous word class or to different ones. And that is the case if we check the list of prepositions that are included in some monographs. It is not possible to find two lists with exactly the same number of items included in them. Next, we will just tackle the issue whether English prepositions should be classified as a closed or an open word class. This is a traditional distinction that can be found in many different grammars, not only of the English language, but also other languages. It is possible to mention here that many authors, including Huddleston, 84, Quirk et al., 85, and even Biber et al. In 1999, classify prepositions within closed word classes, and the main reason for doing so is that it is not possible to create new members. However, it is also possible to find other references according to which this word class does not seem to be as closed as others. So it is possible even to say that prepositions would belong to an open word class. And this is what Jacobson did in 1977, when he underscored the following idea. It is clear that prepositions in English do not form a closed class in the way that articles and pronouns do. This becomes even more apparent if we include complex prepositions like as for, due to, by means of, etc. Other scholars also hold a similar view. Thus, for instance, Biber et al. Said that new prepositions develop out of verb forms, for example, regarding, and sequences of orthographic words, for instance, on account of. 3 years later, Huddleston and Tollon also mentioned that prepositions belong to a relatively close word class. And it is possible to find that there is some kind of overlap or conversion, according to these authors, not only between prepositions and adjectives, for example, close, due, and worth, but also between prepositions and other verbs, including ing forms such as concerning and following. According to some scholars, this is due to a grammaticalization process, which can be defined as the linguistic phenomenon by means of which certain lexical units become function words, as expressed by Van Kemenade in 1999, mentioned in Ornochelith. In fact, this scholar classified prepositions into three different groups according to their morphological origin. So the nominal prepositions, such as by means of and in spite of, are derived from nouns, whereas the adjectivals and the verbal, respectively, are derived from adjectives like near and verbs such as considering or given. Some years before that, Jespersen, in his grammar published between the beginning of the 20th century, and also in the grammar that he published in 1933, created a new word class called particles. This part of speech would be including some of the traditional parts of speech that were already mentioned, such as conjunctions, adverbs, and even prepositions. According to this Danish scholar, some particles can be used in one capacity only, others may be used now as adverbs, now as prepositions, and now as conjunctions, others again in two of these capacities. Having said that, it is possible to find that a possible solution for these problematic areas within the description of English prepositions would be the so-called linguistic gradients. From our point of view, this would be of much help for describing them from an accurate perspective. In fact, Arts at the beginning of the last decade was arguing that gradients should have a role to play in language studies, not only descriptive, but also theoretical. So we can see that there are different views on gradients according to different scholars. For some of them, it would be a helpful resource, but that is not the case for some others. So for instance, Arts is in favor of them, since gradients in grammar is usually characterized as the phenomenon of blurred boundaries between two categories of form classes. So we can show our agreement with this scholar on the use of morphosyntactic tests that can establish whether an item belongs to a particular class or to a bordering one by weighing up the form class features that apply to the item in question. So, in order to reach this aim, the first step would be to compile what are the defining features of prepositions according to different scholars, so that instead of just relying on a single list, we should be having a list provided by the different scholars and just putting them together. Then it will be possible to establish a gradients depending on the number of prepositional characteristics that a given word presents. The more characteristics would make these prepositions more central, whereas the items with a lower number of features will belong to the peripheral group of prepositions. With regard to conclusions, this research has allowed us to reach a number of them. Of course, we should begin with the complex nature of prepositions. Their identification has shown that there is a number of problems which are associated with them. For that reason, it should be our first aim to try to reach an accurate identification of them before moving on to the next steps. Needless to say, the problematic areas can be also found at other descriptive levels. That is to say, they are not only present at morphology, but they can also be of syntactic and semantic nature. Of course, it is possible to anticipate that there will be other aspects which are also worth further research in order to draw a higher number of conclusions. Thus, for example, in the next stages of our research, we will aim to focus on the distinction between simple and complex prepositions. Let me finish with the list of the references that have been used for this presentation. Of course, the number of references will be further increased when tackling the written version of this paper. Let me finish by saying thank you very much for your attention. Now, I will be glad to answer any question you may have, not only through the conference platform, but I will also remain at your disposal through my email address. Have a nice day.